My name is David Scane. I'm in the advocacy local team here at SEC Newgate. So what that means is we work with developers and promoters to help engage with communities and with politicians and to really sort of strike at the heart of the ESG agenda, which is very very important to that discipline. I'm going to hand over now to our guests. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and say a little bit about their companies, and then we're going to jump into the debate. We've got lots of very interesting questions today. We did a rehearsal last week where the conversation was flowing, so I dare say the same is going to happen again today. So Leslie, I'll hand over to you first.
Thanks, David. Thanks very much for having me. My name is Leslie Roberts. I work for Allsop, specialising in build to rent. Part of my job is to work with investors, developers, sometimes other operators as well, to look at how buildings are operated, how the management side of schemes work, the efficiency within that. And then I also head up Allsop Letting and Management, which is a dare I say, sector-leading build-to-rent specialist. We work for a lot of investors in this space to help them realise their ambitions to help build-to-rent sector grow.
Excuse me, I'm Tony Garland, Development Director of Watkin Jones. So we've been around for 200 years. I won't go through the history, I'll be here all day, but we are probably the leading developer in residential for rent. So our history is PBSA. We currently have about 4,000 BTR unit schemes in the pipeline. Our development pipeline is 1.8 billion at the moment and rising. We're really in this space across the whole of the UK. ESG is something I'm very passionate about on behalf of the company, so that's why I'm here today. And very much we've got Fresh Management, who are a group company of ours, so we do cradle to grave really, but we deal with investors actually from planning. So it's quite a cash-light business, but we keep involved till the end and beyond. So that's me.
Morning, I'm Alex Note. I'm the Placemaking and Investment Director for PFP Capital. That's the fund and asset management arm of the Places for People group. So we have 3 funds across the UK that has 750 million under management, and we deliver sort of all tenures of residential-led regeneration, including build-to-rent within that. I've been working in build-to-rent space for 15 years and was one of the kind of, I edited the ULI best practice guides on build-to-rent, which, lots of people in the audience I recognise were involved with as well, but has really been seen as the kind of benchmark, the Bible for what build-to-rent is as distinct from good residential. With an ESG hat on, I chair the ESG and residential working group at the British Property Federation and also on the ESG committee at the AREF, which is the Association for Real Estate Funds. So I collect lots of acronyms. But it's really important, I think, to have this conversation about where build-to-rent specifically can drive the ESG agenda in residential.
Good morning, Alastair Mullins, Managing Director of Virtus. We're part of the Canary Wharf Group. Canary Wharf Group owns and manages the 124-acre estate in East London at the northern edge of the Isle of Dogs. Virtus looks after the build-to-rent assets for the group, is the operator for the group. We currently have 1,100 units under management across 3 buildings that started to complete perfectly at the beginning of 2020, right into COVID, and the last building completed in July last year. Currently set at about 73% leased, which we're pretty happy with based on the conditions that we went through. Alongside that, we've got 176 discount market rent units, which we manage for Canary Wharf Group as well. We currently have in the pipeline on the estate a further 370-odd co-living style units, and a further 1,300 build-to-rent units. And also we're just looking at the moment at a change of use on an office scheme to Resi to bring forward another 500 build-to-rent units. And of the aspiration with Virtus, a separate brand from Canary Wharf Group, is to hopefully go further than Canary Wharf, the location, in the future years.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much. An absolute expert panel to discuss this topic today. So the focus of today's discussion is obviously how can BTR lead the property industry on ESG. So why don't we start off with that rather broad question? Perhaps come to Tony first. Why is BTR in particular well placed to help set the agenda for the rest of the property industry in terms of ESG?
Well, I think a dramatic difference of BTR is it's designed from the beginning. So you can literally look at placemaking from the outset. And in terms of the environmental credentials of that, certainly for the S and the social, to produce more amenity per person, to make sure the amenity, the roof areas are utilised to a maximum. You're building the roofs, maximise every inch, make sure people have outside space. I think we need to be designing, and we do, areas of amenity that allow people, if they want to be segregated and go and work themselves, let them crack on, have a small area of privacy, make sure there's lots of co-working opportunities for people. And I think people generally want to be kind of working in communal areas where they can decide to communicate with others and enjoy a social event, or they can decide to work by themselves. So I think design's really important. It's hugely important. The second point for me is tenant engagement. If you have years of tenant engagement and knowing what people want within a building, you can definitely design to suit that purpose. And that is a social improvement to something that may be designed just to get the amount of units you need on a site, for example. And I think finally would be data. It's education and data from an ESG point of view. So we've trialled with Fresh Utopia, which is sensors in apartments. We know how people are using them. We know how the energy is used, so we can reduce energy use. That's a dramatic change in the market. That tends to happen on BTR. It does on our student as well. So I think it's all about tenant engagement and understanding the market. From a design, just quickly, from a design point of view, from Canary Wharf's point of view, where I worked with Alastair previously, I think all of these larger developments and buildings, you can have the opportunity to put in air source heat pumps. You don't always have to go to district heating. Dramatic carbon savings. So if you set the stall out, look at PV, look at all of the renewable technology. Battery is coming on leaps and bounds. It's not perfect, but you can explore all of the design from day one. That reduces carbon massively. So from an ESG perspective, BTR is a massive opportunity. That's my opinion about this.
Yeah, from a first wave kind of build to rent product perspective, a lot of the exit options for early investors was, we'll break this up, particularly London apartments, infill, we'll break this up and we'll sell it into the sales market. Therefore, we're going to have a boiler in each apartment because we might need to put a lease on it, we need to separate it out. Actually, if you're truly designing a build to rent product that is going to be rented in perpetuity, it will be sold, it will be the whole building will be sold to another build to rent operator that's trading as that. Therefore, you can put all the M&E, all the utility into the core of the building. It's vastly more efficient, and particularly in an energy crisis that we're in at the moment, both for consumers and for you as the kind of institutional operator, that's actually a much better way to proceed. But that decision, taken really, really at the very first stage of design, does dictate whether you're doing a true build to rent or something where you're slightly hedging your bets and maybe might move it into other tenures later on. But I think where the kind of later providers have really looked at taking that bold move, you're able to drive really, really interesting efficiencies in the way that you run the building through that kind of centralizing everything into the core. You can also get rid of some of the main complaints, particularly in taller buildings, about the overheating in the corridors and that kind of thing. You can actually deal with that much more efficiently as well.
I think really good point. I think where we are now in build to rent, we're learning a lot from the first phase that has come through. And I think as an industry, we're quite friendly, very open door policy. Everybody's been to see everybody else's assets that have completed. And so we're all learning from each other. And that means we can learn quickly. We can move, change design quickly. Everyone's very happy to share what they've learned. And we're seeing it just in our own assets. On what we've developed, what we've made mistakes in the first set of buildings, we're not making the same mistakes in the future buildings. So I think, and that also comes from the tenant and the data. So the data we're building up, the tenant feedback we're getting from our current residents is absolutely key in helping us design so that we can be more efficient in the next set of buildings.
I think the tone of all of that sentiment around the design is really important. I think that because this is such a emerging sector, it's almost like build to rent is the trendsetter. And because these developments are happening quite quickly, and we're able to influence in many ways from a design perspective, but also that means we can influence consumer habits, consumer behaviors. And I think that that's really important, because this is all of our problem and all of our solution, all of us to have the same, take part in the solution. So we also have a huge wave of investment coming into this market. So it's the perfect place for investment to make informed decisions, for behaviors to be able to be influenced from the consumer's end, and also supporting the property sector. So it's kind of like we've got these three fantastic components of property, investment, and people, consumers. And I think that we're really well placed to actually influence and do leadership and set the trends.
That's a really interesting point that you made about sort of sharing the data and being very open with the rest of the industry, with essentially competitors. And I suppose one of the other questions that sort of leads on from that is that what's driving the ESG agenda? Is it sort of looking at what competitors are doing and thinking, okay, well, we need to be doing that as well? Is it an investor's perspective? Leslie, I'd be interested to hear your.
I don't see anybody in this room, and Alastair would probably be my closest competitor, but I don't see actually build to rent being competitive in its own space. I actually think where our competitor is probably the wider PRS sector in terms of the buy to let, and actually looking at the sort of the PRS that is not fit for purpose, really. And I see that as a massive opportunity for the build to rent sector to be able to offer better opportunities and choices for consumers. I think that by collaborating, and also chair the UK AA, which is a massive space for us to share. It's the industry body for build to rent. Encourage you all to join. And that's a space where we all collaborate and learn and evolve the sector for the betterment of consumers, for the betterment of us in the property sector, and for investors. And it's a virtuous circle. So I don't see us as competitors. I see it as collaborators. And the influence of ESG in this argument is really about the funds. The funds, we're getting to the point where they will not lend unless this is really high up on the agenda. BREEAM, GRESB reporting, fit well certification, all of these things, either retrofitting or going into new developments, is right at the top of the priority list.
Yeah, I think two things. So exactly as Leslie says, when you're making a market, there is 0 point cannibalizing the other person who's trying to make the market with you. We spend a lot of time looking at the US, but that's sort of 25, 30 years ahead of us. And actually, when you look at that, that is a trading market of stabilized assets. It's very little development. There's a bit of refresh, but it's predominantly these very operating businesses that are sold in their entirety to other traders. That's what, it's an investment market. We are, 1.2% of the UK kind of housing stock. And exactly as Leslie says, in the private rented sector, when 26% of that private rented sector doesn't meet the decent home standard, the point the government got behind this is because of that quality and choice that you can offer British renters, that it can actually be a positive experience to rent. That the ESG element is absolutely driven by institutional investment, which is actually a long way ahead of regulation right now. It was floating around. I think there was 10 years ago, investors were they wanted the S tick, they wanted the affordable housing, they'd throw some money at an RP, but they didn't really get that involved in the operations of what the product really was. Whereas now it's very, when we're pitching to sort of sovereign wealth funds and pension funds, it's not a kind of appendix at the back, it's really upfront, very detailed. What metrics are you using? What reporting are you doing? As many of you will have seen, the challenge in kind of just wider residential is that almost all of the 500 plus ESG metrics that exist and certifications and benchmarks are entirely designed for commercial real estate because it's far more homogenous, it's much easier, it's much less granular than the quirk of kind of a resi unit by unit approach. So the BPF guidance that we published that you can all get online last year actually breaks down the certifications, some of which Leslie mentioned, so Fitwell, BREEAM, GRESB and so on, and points out where they are relevant for kind of build to rent and resi in particular. But there is a gap there in the market. There isn't just the perfect certification that we as a build to rent sector can use. So I think, again, it is about the collaboration and those of us for sharing which ones we are using that do work, what is driving it forward, and what metrics our investors are requiring us to use that we can actually meet. Because one of the challenges around the data point that Tony made is that we don't have absolute control, nor should we, of our tenants' energy consumption and demand, but we can influence, we can advise, but getting hold of the data and how we can manage that over time to reduce kind of carbon in particular is a real challenge.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. BREEAM, for example, is on commercial premises, right? So if you're on a BTR scheme, you'd look at the ground floor, you'd look at retail, you'd look at office, and really that's it for BREEAM on that. It just so happens we obviously do student, and we've got a large, building schemes all over the country, and we can use BREEAM for student because they're self-contained, they're small units, etc. They have shared kitchens. HQM, for example, was not popular only a year ago. We are using HQM 4-star now on residential. Home quality mark, sorry, getting technical. Home quality mark is it's a bit like home sustainable homes type of scenario where there are points for design, right? And it's becoming more popular. And your point is exactly right. There isn't enough guidance really to say these are the standards for residential BTR. And the other thing, coming from a private developer background for 20 years before I got into the BTR and student market, I couldn't agree with you more. I think we designed from day one, and we've got a massive opportunity here to improve carbon, and the ESG actually brings people together rather than that competitive nature, in my opinion. If you're genuinely passionate about it, we've got the same with investors. We work with pension funds all the time for investment, you know, really large ones in the country. What we tend to do is we take their targets, but we're trying to improve our own beyond that. And you know, it's not a sales pitch. It genuinely is a passion that we need to get ahead of that curve, and it's going to help everyone, I think so.
I do generally think as well, consumers are going to start demanding this. Our customers, our residents, especially already on the E side, environmental, they want to see that. You know, look at the moment that the current crisis in energy means that, you know, so many other residents are talking about it, saying, how do I turn off my cooling in my apartment? I don't want it on this year. I'm just going to use my window. So I think that's absolutely key. And then the social bit. It will come in more and more as people, I think COVID's been a big change for that as well. We saw it throughout our buildings where people wanted to come together and communities came together during COVID, not just in build-to-rent buildings, but across the UK, communities pulled together, looked after older generations, did shopping for them. And that social bit is so key to people's well-being that I think the consumers are going to start demanding this as well. And I think that's where we can lead because we are so well connected with our consumers in comparison to the wider PRS and other property markets.
And is that so on that point about sort of creating communities, you know, sort of to move more onto the SG side of things, is that something that's organic, or is it something that you sort of manage to a certain extent to bring people together, or do you just sort of give them the tools and off they go?
We have an in-house events team, but only because we've got some wonderful amenity spaces, we want to see them used. But it is about trying to engage residents to get them to bring forward their ideas for events. And we now have resident-run events on a regular basis, a lot focusing around well-being, which is brilliant. So yeah, but I think there's two things. You've got to give them the space. You've got to give them the ability to do what they want to do in it. But also the technologies. We've got apps so they can actually, within that, they create their own little chats, communities. The great thing is we can actually see from the outside looking in as the operator what they're talking about if there's something wrong in the building we're not aware of. So that's also useful. But it's giving them the tools and the tech and the space and an events team to help them do it. I think a really good example of what we saw is how communities come together. We did a wine tasting evening and a really diverse group of people from Newfoundland came along. There was an international student, there was a Bank of Mum and Dad guy that was living there that was paying, whose parents were paying the rent. There was a banker, there was a lady that runs a wellness company, and they all had a nice glass of wine together. Then they all headed out for dinner, and the team were amazed that this random group of people had gone out together. But to me, that's the community. That is a community, because community is not a single demographic. It's a wide range of people coming together.
Is that perhaps something that BTR can influence the rest of the industry on? In the sense of, Leslie, how would that?
Do you mean in terms of community?
In terms of sort of fostering more of a community in development, or is it unique to BTR in the sense that you've...
No, definitely not. I think, you know, to Alastair's point, that we organically curate communities. So it's quite an art to be not too forceful, but also to encourage dwell time and natural touch points, which comes back to how you design good build to rent spaces, because you want to create incremental touch points for residents. So that could be the front desk, it could be the coffee machine, it could be the parcel lockers, the post room, even the waste, the electric car charging station. All of these things are actually designed surreptitiously to get everybody to kind of do this sort of incremental touch time. So they have the choice, and then organically they all go out to dinner together. But that, I think that there's something about the authenticity of our industry really understanding the importance of community. And the one thing I would say, this is all down to people. So we spend a lot of time finding the right people to employ at our developments, because that ultimately forms the tone, the culture, and the community, what would you say, ethos. And that's really important to set right from the start. So the culture of your development will be the personality of the GM. That's the best advice I could probably give to somebody in this industry. So choose carefully, and so choose people who are authentically, genuinely interested in people, improvement, engagement, and fundamentally believe in that, because that makes a difference. And it's not exclusive to build to rent. I always say this about recruiting CEOs. It's like, you look at the personality of the CEO, that will be the culture of the business. And it's not exclusive, it's just about people. But Alex wants to say something.
No, it's exactly, okay, there's two things around community. There is the community of your residents within the building, and so all the art that Leslie and Azra are talking about is really, really key. And we have moved on from the kind of the dusty corridors that were kind of, you know, like the Hilton business lounges, where it's like, this is a spare space, we'll just put some tables in it and maybe it'll get used, and it's dusty and it's horrible and no one wants to spend time there. You know, it's evolved massively to that art of, you know, how do you maximize these interaction points? But you've also, you know, got the community around them and the community that was already there in a place. And there's a lot of criticism, particularly of early stage build to rent, that it's very much ivory towers, all your amenities in-house, and the gym's only for the residents. And that actually is the antithesis of community, and it's the antithesis of placemaking. So, you know, what we look at, if, you know, there are places people happen to own a fairly large leisure centre business, which is useful, but, you know, there's zero point us putting a gym into a building if we own one around the corner, or we can actually do a deal with a local gym owner who's, you know, we can support a local business. And it's much more about how can we embed our building and the amenities within that. There are important things that need to be private and secure for residents only, and, you know, dining spaces and that kind of thing. But actually it's about blending in and bleeding into the place that was already there, supporting those local businesses. And I think that became very, very important through COVID. And, you know, that art is something that's done and has been done extensively in affordable housing and social housing communities for many, many years. But there's this very odd, no, a lot when I talk to people who've been in resi and more traditional sales, where they kind of go, do people in rental talk to their neighbours? Do they have a community? Because there is this idea that you have to live in a cul-de-sac or in a house in order to have that kind of interaction, and it's just not true. And whether it is a kind of single family rental kind of houses or it is apartment blocks, people absolutely do form those connections, but they need the space to do so. The flip side, I think, and the kind of very dark bit of kind of HMOs is there's a really sort of sad proportion of something like 13% of those that are in kind of very, very poor quality. There's quite a high instance of people dying who basically are not being discovered, because you've got 6 or 7 people living in a flat where there's no dining room anymore. The kitchen, they have to kind of go into shifts. There was a guy in Bristol, near where I live, who literally took 2 weeks for him to be found because he's had a heart attack in his bedroom. And, you know, they didn't know each other, none of the people in the house, because it was just a kind of coming and going, that there was no space for them to circulate, to socialise. And actually that is 13% of our housing market is stock like that, that's really, really poor. And that needs to be addressed. So the community bit isn't just a kind of a tick box in the marketing and a kind of Club 1830, let's just make it all really fun. It is genuinely allowing people to make these places feel at home. And that's something that the UK is very, very bad at, actually. We've always treated renting as something to get out of as quickly as possible.
Yeah, the tech, sorry, it's just an important point. The tech, for example, advances, we were talking about utopia earlier, sensors. You know, where you've got elderly communities and there's sensors in there to know if someone's actually moved, would completely eradicate that issue, okay? And it's very simple technology, and it's not a big brother. It's actually a learning tool. It's so different.
And we set our retirement business.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, at some point, you know, we'll all look at that kind of tenure as well, and it needs to develop as BTR is. And a great example of this, working back in the day for high-value developers, is the famous cinema room, right? So you're spending a fortune on one area, you're going to acoustically make it perfect, you're going to put a screen up and it will be used 4 times a week, if you're lucky. Or you'll end up, and I'm sorry, but this is a fact, if you're lucky, or you end up with a multi-purpose screen, something that's acoustically okay, so you're not disturbing neighbours, you rent it out to the renters, they can have their family over if they want to, they can look at a sports event. So it's designing every inch to be absolutely usable. So people aren't in their rooms or just left there going, well, we'll book the cinema room once a week. That's a really simple example of how BTR can work. You can literally design from day one. So that's a big advantage, I think.
Is there a bit of a perception, Alex, and this was a point you were discussing the other week, about sort of how people see BTR? So they might see it as a cinema room. It's almost a bit like living in a sort of luxury hotel. It's you know, but actually it's not necessarily just that. There are sort of other tenures you can
well, there's 2 challenges. There's one that the consumer doesn't know. People don't know what build to rent is. We've given this really clunky name because it's what the government wanted to call it, to differentiate it from kind of traditional residential. You know, lots of the institutions and lots of the big agents are calling it multifamily because that's what the big pensions are used to investing in. That's the established asset class in the US, so you're hearing that as well. So yeah, from a consumer point of view, it's a kind of like the Donald Rumsfeld known knowns and unknown knowns. They don't know it till they've experienced it. And once you have lived in it, you'll probably go, oh, this is great. I want that again. I understand the concept. But if you haven't had it, when you're looking at it on, say, Zoopla, it's very unhelpful to the market because you're not comparing apples with apples. You've got, you know, it doesn't show that you're including the broadband and all the amenity and all the great things that, you know, a build to rent does include. So, you know, we've got a big consumer education job. And actually, Leslie's leading a lot of that with the UKAA, but there's a big job to do there. I think it's more actually educating the planning authorities as well. That's why I think there is a bigger barrier. There's a bigger bottleneck right now. For all the reasons we've discussed, that first wave of build to rent is almost inherently all quite high end and luxury. And there's absolutely a place for that in the market, and there always will be. But that isn't all of it. And actually, if you look at the locations that major operators, not just the regional cities, it's towns like Leicester and Derby and places that are, crying out for good quality mid-market rental accommodation that provides security of tenure and a quality experience for people. That isn't all the bells and whistles. It is amenitized and it's designed in all the ways these guys are talking about, but it's something the institutions can get behind because it's meeting their targets and delivering a return fundamentally. But the planners particularly look at the stuff that's been delivered and go, well, you're bringing something like that. That's a million miles away from our kind of affordable rent. So no, we don't want it. And that is a problem.
It's education again as well. I think just for a really boring fact, if you take a metal panel and you look at anodise, which on a high value development, the planners would be very keen on, because within 10 feet you can tell the difference between, say, I don't know, PPC, poly powder coated finish. There's 30% more carbon in that process for what they would consider a better finish to a facade, right? So, and that's not their fault or issue, but it's education. It's going, right, we need to get on this ESG agenda in full for carbon reduction in embodied carbon for scope 1, 2 and 3. We haven't got enough time for all of that. But so my point is, it's education, and it's not anyone's fault if they don't understand, if they're sitting in a planning authority going, I don't understand this facade material. What we need to do as developers with knowledge is educate and get into communities, have discussions with planners and say, this is not a tick box, it's a daily thing. We're literally embracing ESG. And even material selection is a small point, but it's a relevant one. And yeah.
On the education point, is that when you look at the residential tenures, you've got essentially, oh, sorry, I've caught student, which is a tenure, it's over here, and it's purpose built. Then you've got retirement over here, later living, which is quite purpose built as well. And in between that is a huge lifespan of activity for all of us to go through that journey. And build to rent has the ability to create all of those different types of requirements for those different age groups and different life requirements, from postgrad students going into something they're used to, from student into that fairly urbanite community, to people who might be coupling up, to families, to downsizers, to empty nesters, to divorcees, whatever it might be, and at all different price points, because highly amenitized, highly not amenitized, but convenience through technology, urban, suburban, somewhere in the middle. There's a huge capacity for the sector to answer a whole lot of those different ranges of demographic needs for residents, and at different affordability points, which is go back to the S part of this. And that's something that we can answer and we can work towards. It's just the hardest part is probably to get scale in this sort of stuff and really push it forward, which is a whole nother topic. But yeah, we have the ability to answer a lot of this, and a lot of it is down to education, to the government and to local authorities about the benefits of BTR. And it's not an ivory tower type of tenure. We have that in the sector, but just like hotels, you have every type of spectrum, from the Western right down to your a hotel. I was going to say EasyJet, but the orange one.
It's almost a case of once you've experienced it in the local authority, then they see it's a good model, and they see it's nothing to be scared of. Or Alistair, you're shaking your head.
They change.
Some dissent, please.
People change. You educate one planning officer, and they move on. But I think, I think if you look at Canary Wharf Group, you look at Vertus, what we've created, we probably have created our first set of product is very much at the premium end of the market, and it was done before my time there. We are now steering away down to a lower end product for our future buildings, which is trying to attract a wide demographic. But when I look at it, we are competing directly against private sale buildings, buy-to-let stock, which actually has tons better amenity than what we have. We don't have swimming pools. Yes, we've got some gym spaces, but actually a lot of our customers are seeing the benefit of having a single landlord, single managing agent. That comes back to the governance point as well. They can see that from the outside, that this is going to be a better place to live. And to Alex's point, unless you've had a bad experience in buy-to-let, or you've experienced a good experience in build to rent, you won't know about it. You really won't. And it's such a small percentage of the market. So that education piece needs to happen with the consumer. It needs to happen with the local authority. And I think one of our biggest challenges is we're building big tall towers. They're expensive to build, unfortunately. And therefore, when we then get hit trying to build to rent at a relatively affordable level, with then a big chunk of actual affordable, with a big A alongside it, it's then not possible. So, and that's trying to educate the authority that we're not going to be able to put that affordable within that building at that level you're talking about. So it's a big challenge.
We talk about governance there, and you know, one of the things that certainly we've come across when dealing with local authorities is they, you know, councillors almost sort of expect there to be problems, and you know, sort of residents come to them with problems, and it's almost, we're talking about ESG, sort of BTR maybe influencing the rest of the industry on ESG, but can BTR also influence local authorities to say, actually, this is a better way of managing properties, this is a better way of sort of responding to people. It doesn't always have to be confrontational. Tony,
yeah, well, the reason being is we go around the country. We're building in Ireland, Scotland. You know, we're all parts of the UK. London's only one area we work with, and as you go around each authority, there's a level of knowledge of BTR which dissipates depending on part of geography you are. And to have a conversation with a local authority on the benefits of it, I find quite fascinating. So what we do is, from a planning point of view, we've got like a vanguard approach where we'll, before we're even going to an area to look at development, we'll meet the different boroughs and the different local authorities and just have a chat. It's just talking. It's not about going, we're coming in with a 30-story tower and I want 5,000 units. We're actually going in without a development and going, let's have a conversation. Let's explain to you our history and knowledge of BTR, all of this great background we have on it and why it's such a benefit. And then a year after, 2 years after, we may go back in with a planning application. Hopefully it's the same planners, otherwise you've got to start all again. But it's education. It's making sure that you've got a genuine approach, not just maximising your development for brownfield, which we all do as developers, let's be honest. You've got to hit the metrics, but genuinely being passionate about what we're doing. And we're finding we're getting quite a long way with that vanguard movement. And I think we could all do it.
And I think, you know, local authorities in the past is an easy whipping boy. And actually, when you're massively underfunded, you know, you're understaffed and you're incredibly constrained, and you're also delivering within a process that we all know is not fit for purpose, but hasn't yet been changed. So, you know, the NPPF 10 years ago said that all local authorities needed a local plan. And of the 306 authorities, 100 have one. And the other 200 are kind of somewhere in the middle of maybe negotiating it, depending on where you are. It's also got, you know, we wrote in the build to rent guide and the language that's adopted in both the London plan and in the NPPF about build to rent having distinct economics and them needing to be acknowledged. You know, that was what wording that we put into it 10 years ago. Again, it depends exactly, so it depends where you are. Some people, you know, in a London borough, you can be like, one will acknowledge that, one will just say straight out, we don't want you anywhere near us. And there is this challenge with the affordable point. Again, our UK kind of regulatory context very unhelpfully just defines affordable as 80% of market rate, but then leaves you a kind of whole very opaque model. You know, we have a very, very effective fund called a mid-market rent fund in Scotland, which works brilliantly because Scotland has that specific tenure, which is set as 80%, but actually this is how we do it. They have an income-related methodology, so that the rents are set based on somebody's individualised income. It's very, very clear, and so that is an affordable tenure that targets families in particular, and we can deliver against that across Scotland. So we've got 1,200 homes across 4 cities, and it was working really, really well. That's vastly more complicated. Just the time that you expend, these guys, you know, having to get to know the planners, get to know their regime, educate them about what your particular build to rent offer comprises, what your, you know, demographic, your intentions long term are. And so when you're competing for, you know, land, time, and all the kind of higher costs that you're carrying, as Alastair said, against the kind of for sale developer who can just get on with it because it's a known quantity, you know, you're going probably to pick authorities that have that experience or that knowledge already. That, you know, there is somewhere along the line, someone's got to kind of pick up that gap in the knowledge and just explain that. For me, build to rent is not affordable tenure, but it helps with wider affordability. And it is that crunch in the middle that all authorities need help with in the housing stock, where build to rent is really valuable.
Of course, the problem with local authorities is, of course, there's a lot of churn. Politics, you know, can change every 4 years. I mean, Leslie, do you have any?
Well, just politics, you say. I was asked to do an expert witness case recently for a build-to-rent development in Basildon, and my case was actually built on Alex's ULI guide, because that was the proof of the concept that we needed 10 years ago to say this is a good investment class. Here's all the reasons why build to rent is good. And actually then I used that against the fact that the sector had moved on And 10 years on, we actually have the proof of the theory that was produced 10 years ago. But the council itself was really for this development, which was 600 units in Basildon town centre, and God knows they need accommodation there. And change of political parties, and there was a non-determination of what was approved at committee, but it was never signed. Change of political parties. They said, we don't want this, it's going to be a ghetto, blah, blah, blah. We won the case, but never mind. It was more like there was just this complete blank of talk to the hand, build to rent is ghettos, it's this, it's too expensive, and all this kind of stuff. But we had to break it down. And fortunately, the planner, the adjudicator was reasonable enough to recognise the benefits, and it was awarded. But it is education, and we managed a development in Newcastle, and the day we took the council around, it was like this light bulb moment. They were like, what, broadband's included? These amenities, they don't have to pay for these amenities? And it was like, no, this is it. Because of the economies of scale, we can offer so much more to the consumer, and that it ticks so many boxes for ESG amongst other things. And it's just that light bulb moment. So, you know, so much for just get out there, go and see it. And we do study tours through the UKAA. Come along.
We'll have to arrange a minibus to take everyone around to show. Fantastic. Well, I mean, this discussion could go on literally for hours. I'm conscious that people in the audience may have some questions to ask our panel.